And now, please welcome our moderator.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us virtually instead of in LA. I am pleased to be joined for the next 15 minutes by Steve Case. Steve, are you there?
I am here. Hi, Dan.
There. Hi, how you doing? So Steve, for those who don't know, currently runs Revolution, which is a venture capital fund which does everything from seed stage investing in the Midwest all through kind of growth stage investing everywhere. He previously ran a company that, if I remember correctly, used to send me CDs in the mail, not Columbia House, but the other one. So Steve, can we start with this? I feel most times I've seen you in person. It's been kind of around the country. I know you're based in DC. I haven't seen you there. Since the pandemic began, how often have you actually been on the road, visiting companies or doing other Revolution-related business?
Not very often. I, like most people, have been kind of mostly sheltering and just trying to play it safe, but being able to use technologies like the Zoom and other things to connect with other people. I do think it's amazing. I was reflecting this summer that it was 35 years ago that we co-founded America Online AOL. At the time, only 3% of people were online, and they're online only 1 hour a week. So the fact that we're now living our lives online because of obviously the pandemic is really quite extraordinary. So we're able to do a lot of things like everybody remotely. And also I've seen an interesting, at least early stages of sort of a boomerang of talent. Some of the people that grew up in the middle of the country, went to school in the middle of the country, left because there wasn't much opportunity there, particularly if they wanted to be part of the innovation economy, wanted to be part of tech startups. They felt they had to go to places like Silicon Valley. Some of those people have decided, at least temporarily, to shelter somewhere else in the country. And well, I guess most of those will eventually return to the coast. Some will stay and either continue to work for their current company remotely, or maybe be part of the community locally, join a startup, start a company there. So I think it really will accelerate some of the trends we've been talking about for a number of years in terms of entrepreneurship dispersing around the country. As you know, 75% of venture capital last year went to just 3 states, California, New York, and Massachusetts. So getting more venture capital to other 47 states, big states, by the way, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, states like that really only get 1% of venture capital each. That's what's going to happen, we think, in the next 10 years. And perhaps, even though there are obviously many terrible aspects of this pandemic, perhaps one of the silver linings is over time, we will see a dispersion of innovation. We will see a dispersion of capital. We will see a dispersion of talent, which would, I think, strengthen the country.
Let me ask on the dispersion of capital piece. Obviously, lots of venture capitalists right now are essentially investing via Zoom, doing due diligence via Zoom or remotely, not going to the coffee shop, not going to the office to have the meetings they used to have. Do you think, for kind of call them the traditional San Francisco / Sand Hill Road venture capitalists, does the last 8 months make it more likely that they would invest in a company rather that's thousands of miles away, or would they still be hesitant because they believe at some point this will end and they'd still prefer to be able to drive down the road to meet the founder as opposed to get on a plane?
Well, of course, it's a mix. Some will just continue to focus in their backyard. That's where they have networks. As you say, it's also more convenient. I understand that, but more and more, I think we'll start looking at the opportunities in other parts of the country. In part because we're starting to see some amazing breakout companies in other parts of the country that are getting multi-billion-dollar valuations, and so that is leading more venture capitalists to start opening their eyes to the idea of other entrepreneurs in other places. And I think the pandemic just accelerates that. Like many things, the pandemic, e-commerce and telehealth, a lot of things were bubbling for a while. The pandemic essentially was a tipping point that accelerated things. I think the same dynamic will happen with the rise of the rest and venture capital and more regional entrepreneurship.
You talked about how some folks, say, who were in kind of some of the coastal hubs, maybe move back home, and you said maybe temporarily, maybe not permanently. Can you unpack that a little bit in terms of what kind of percentage of technologists, entrepreneurs you think might actually have left for good? And I guess I ask it in the context of this question: how much of these trends that have been pulled forward, as you reference it, have been pulled forward permanently or just kind of ephemeral, here for now because we're mostly stuck in our homes?
The answer is obviously I don't know, and I don't think that some of the predictions of a mass exodus of cities like New York or San Francisco is going to happen. I think most people will end up returning, but I think a meaningful minority will decide based on this. It's also been a little bit of a tipping point, shake the snow globe moment for people and their families and their lives, not just their careers. And that is leading some people to reassess kind of where they want to live, where they want to raise their family. And we also need to recognize that what I call the third wave of the internet. The first wave was getting everybody online. The second wave was apps and software running on top of the internet, Facebook and Google, et cetera, et cetera. The third wave of the internet, which we're just entering now, is when the internet meets the everyday life and it starts impacting things like healthcare and food and agriculture, things like that. Well, the expertise you need to be successful in those industries, the domain expertise, the credibility to establish partnerships with hospitals or health plans or to navigate some of the complicated policy kind of regulatory issues. A lot of that expertise is in the middle of the country. A lot of the key partners are in the middle of the country. In healthcare, for example, the most important health companies are in the middle of the country. The most important kind of research universities are in the middle of the country. So that also is a reason why, even before the pandemic, some people, whether it be entrepreneurs or investors, were saying, maybe even though the Silicon Valley really dominated that second wave when it was just about apps and virality and so forth, as we think about this next wave and deal with other aspects of our lives that are up for disruption, perhaps being in other parts of the country will be a strategic advantage. I'll give you one example. We backed a company in Chattanooga called Freightways that sort of has a Bloomberg data platform for the trucking industry. Well, guess what? I didn't know this, but many of the big trucking companies are headquartered in Chattanooga. So if you want to build Bloomberg for trucking, better to be in Chattanooga than San Francisco or New York. You'd understand the culture of trucking. You'd have the relationships to establish the partnerships, the initial anchor customers to make that possible. We're seeing more and more examples of that all over the country, which is leading us to be more confident this rise of the rest phenomenon, where over time venture capital spreads more broadly, or over time breakthrough companies that really can be iconic kind of bellwether companies in different cities will start to rise up again.
Leaving the geography piece out of it for a minute, you mentioned telehealth earlier. Are there certain sectors that you at Revolution, you and your partners at Revolution, are, from your perspective, looking at a lot harder now than you might have been 8 or 9 months ago because of the pandemic? Things, as you say, have been brought forward, but maybe things that you hadn't really been paying too much attention to previously?
Sure. No, the kind of the centerpiece of what we do at Revolution is Revolution Growth, the later stage investments. One of our companies in the e-commerce space, BigCommerce, recently went public quite successfully. Obviously, we've seen over the last 7 or 8 months a big acceleration in terms of what's happening with e-commerce. We're also investors in telehealth, a company called Talkspace, focused on digital mental health. They've seen a dramatic growth in their business over the last 7, 8 months. We also invested in Tempus, which is doing some really interesting things around oncology, but also launched some efforts specifically focused on a virus and testing. We're investors in a mobile gaming company, Scopely, that's seen a big acceleration because of this pandemic. We're also investors in Clear, which most people think of as a company they use to have a fast path through the airport security lines. They've also pivoted and have a health pass that they're working with some of the major sports leagues with. So we've seen enormous momentum across a number of companies in our Revolution Growth portfolio, where actually the pandemic has been this trigger point, this tipping point, this accelerator in terms of some of the trends in those industries. Some of that will end up getting kind of rolled back, but most of that will end up being permanent. For example, in the telehealth area, a lot of regulations were relaxed. And policies from health plans were relaxed because suddenly in-person visits weren't possible. My guess is over the next few years, many of those rules that were put in place 10, 20, 30 years ago that were relaxed because of the pandemic will stay relaxed, because that actually is a better way to provide affordable, convenient care with great outcomes.
I wonder, on the earlier side, it's one thing for an established company to have to go remote, and it's very difficult. For any company, I think that had most people working in an office to transition to remote, and there were lessons learned. I wonder though, when you're looking at relatively new young companies, that's kind of when everybody's all together. It seems to matter more that they're all together, right? They can pass each other in the hallways, they can be in the same room, ideas can bounce off each other. Do you feel that kind of early stage company formation and early, year 1, year 2 growth can be done as efficiently remotely as it can be done on premise?
Well, I'm probably a traditionalist. I kind of like having teams together in a physical space, but we've seen many examples of companies over the last decade. WordPress now has over 1,000 employees, kind of all remote. And in the last 7, 8 months, we've seen a number of companies we've backed also being remote. So there are different ways because of technologies that enable you to do things now you could have done 10 or 20 years ago, obviously. And we've seen with our Rise the Rest seed fund, and we have great investors, including Mike Milken in that fund, and Jeff Bezos, and Howard Schultz, and Meg Whitman, and Tory Burch, and Ray Dalio, and David Rubenstein, Henry Kravis, John Doerr. Amazing group of investors are joining us on this Rise of the Rest effort. So far, we've made 150 investments in over 70 cities. And we're really seeing tremendous interest in terms of what's happening in these cities, and that includes over the last 7, 8 months. Our activities over the last 6 months in terms of looking at new investment opportunities and actually committing to new investments is actually accelerated, in part because I think this Rise of the Rest trend is accelerating, and some of our friends that were coastal investors are starting to look at more opportunities and want to partner with us on some of those investments.
So you mentioned earlier some of these regulations on the telehealth side that you think have been relaxed and you think will stay relaxed. Let me ask just regulation broadly and politics broadly, since we are, what's today? Yeah, we're exactly 2 weeks away from Election Day at this point. Do you believe, are there any kind of areas, I guess is a better way to put it, that you invest in or that Revolution invests in that you think will be significantly impacted by the outcome of the presidential race?
Sure. Our basic theme is partly around looking at entrepreneurs in other places, but also looking at industries that are about to get disrupted. And our strategy, we call it the P's, or we look for companies where partnerships really matter, strategic partnerships that can accelerate your growth. Policy really matters. There are regulatory issues that you have to think about, both issues in terms of getting into the market in some cases, but also issues where policy changes can accelerate opportunities. We've seen that with one of our companies, DraftKings, that also went public via SPAC recently. They've actually seen a real acceleration and interest in what they're doing because rules, policies, regulations change, in that case around gaming. So we're kind of trying to figure out kind of where the puck is going and position Revolution and the companies we back for the trends that we think are coming. And these third wave trends are a key part of that. And in the third wave, whether it be healthcare or food or smart cities or fintech or what have you, regulations do matter more. Government does matter more. And sometimes entrepreneurs don't like to hear that because it's sort of frustrating. But I think that's going to be more and more the issue in the future.
I think I know your personal politics, but leaving that aside, are one of these two candidates better for Revolution's portfolio purely from an ROI standpoint?
Well, I do try to stay out of the political side of things. So I would say we have an election in 2 weeks. No matter what turns out, we'll try to do the best we can. And I will continue to work in a bipartisan way. I worked with President Trump on the Opportunity Zone legislation, worked with President Obama on the Jobs Act, jumpstarting our Business Startups Act, worked previously with President Bush and also President Clinton, including some of the initial rules that put the commercialized access to the internet. So we'll let the people decide. My hope is whoever is the next president, they will focus on making sure America remains the most innovative entrepreneurial nation in the world. Make sure we're backing entrepreneurs everywhere, including diverse entrepreneurs. By the way, last year less than 10% of venture capital went to women, even though they represent half of our country. Even though Black Americans are 14% of our population, Black founders get less than 1% of our venture capital, which is why we launched a Rise the Rest virtual tour in December, focused specifically on Black founders. And we're going to end up partnering with more than 100 venture capitalists from all around the country who will join us as part of that pitch competition and have individual meetings with companies. We need to level the playing field in terms of opportunities so everybody has a shot at the American dream and every city has an opportunity to rise, and we see job growth and economic growth happening everywhere.
We have 90 seconds left, but you mentioned DraftKings that went public earlier this year via SPAC. So let me just ask quickly about SPACs. From your perspective, what's the basic reason for why it's gone from this tiny little cottage industry, which, every year there was a couple dozen of them, to this basic circus where almost every single venture capital, private equity firm, hedge fund manager seems to be raising one?
Well, I think we kind of are at peak SPAC. As you know, it's been around for a while, more than a decade, but it really picked up steam in the last year. In part, actually, DraftKings, as I mentioned, one of our companies, has I think the most successful SPAC of all time. People watched that success and how the company's done and how the sponsors have done, and said, "Hey, maybe I should do that too." And there are some advantages to companies. We still have a number of other companies in our portfolio that are talking to SPAC sponsors while also considering IPO paths, while also considering kind of late stage kind of growth rounds. So and I think giving entrepreneurs, giving companies more options in terms of raising capital is a good thing. And also, one of the things I like about SPACs is I've for many years talked about democratizing access to entrepreneurship, not just for the entrepreneurs, but also for the investors. And I've never liked the fact that in the last few years, the late stage investors, SoftBank in particular, basically were resulting in companies staying private much longer. And when they actually were going public, there wasn't that much upside. When AOL went public in 1992, the first internet company to go public, our market value that day was $70 million. 8 years later, it was $160 billion. I think it was up 11,000%, the best performing stock of the decade. Well, guess what? Individual retail investors were able to benefit from that. They believed in what we were building and invested in and backed us, and they were able to make money that send their kids to school and buy a house and so forth. So that's one aspect I like about SPACs. But clearly, we're going to see a flight to quality, better sponsors that really add real value, probably a shift in the economics that are going to be more kind of focused on the back end, so the sponsors only do well if the companies do well. So I think there'll be some things that still need to happen as this gets further down the life cycle and gets mature. But I think SPACs have generally been a good thing for entrepreneurship, and we're supportive of them. We also like the fact that IPOs are coming back again. We like the fact direct listings, perhaps with some primary shares, will be out there. More options for entrepreneurs. And more options for companies to raise capital, to scale, to innovate, to create jobs, to drive economic growth is a good thing for our country.
Last thing, very quickly, yes, no, I guess. Is Revolution seriously considering sponsoring its own SPAC?
We're looking at it. We're looking at it like everybody, but right now we're mostly focused on working with the companies in our current portfolio where there's interest in raising capital and interest from SPAC sponsors and trying to understand the opportunities there.
Steve, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Dan.
And now, please welcome our moderator.
Hi, good to see you again. How you doing? Dan Primack of Axios. I am pleased to bring on our panel, if we can bring them all up onto the screen. There we go. Almost everybody. Almost everybody. We're missing Abraham. Do we have him? Maybe not quite yet. All right, so we will start. This is a little bit different. Usually I like to be able to just kind of go down a line of people who are physically in a room, but we can't do that. So what I'd like to just start is to have each of you introduce yourselves relatively briefly. Imagine this is kind of like a first date, like you want to give people a little bit of information about yourself, but not so much they get bored. So Nick, let me start with you, and then we'll move down kind of counterclockwise.
Sure. So my name's Nick Green. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Thrive Market. We are an online e-commerce platform on a mission to make healthy living easy and accessible to everybody. So a lot of people describe us as Whole Foods meets Costco online. I would describe us as Whole Foods meets Costco meets Trader Joe's, because we also have a brand of our own that's about 30% of the products. We sell everything from snacks and cooking products to pet and baby and body care. Basically anything non-perishable that you find in a grocery store, always organic, always healthy, always non-GMO, always sustainably produced. And then we ship it anywhere in the country with carbon neutral shipping. Our fulfillment centers are zero waste, and we have scaled very fast over the last 6 months, as you can imagine, as people have sheltered in place and looked for ways to stay healthy and safe during the pandemic.
Jeanette. You're on mute.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeanette. I co-founded La Familia. We are an early stage B2B fund based out of Berlin in Germany, Europe, focusing primarily on B2B technology companies, so anything that enables or disrupts large sector industries. Our main hypothesis is that looking at the European ecosystem, we see a lot of companies either being enabled through technology or disrupted through technology, and that creates this huge white space that we're going after. from an investment hypothesis. We are primarily looking into seed stage companies, so really companies that are just going to market across different sector verticals, all the way from logistics, supply chain, to sustainability, to industrial, to the future of work, and have actually seen a very rapid adoption over the past couple of months of B2B technologies across the field. So happy to dive deeper into that later on in the discussion, and looking forward to the rest of the panel now.
And Irene.
Hi, good evening from Malaysia. I'm Irene. I'm president of AirAsia Digital. So it's part of AirAsia Group. AirAsia is the largest low-cost carrier in Asia. And what we have done is very interesting. About 3 years ago, we embarked on a digitalization journey, a digital transformation journey. So hence the birth of AirAsia Digital, where we build all non-airline digital businesses backed by our assets that we have built from the airlines, such as data, our network, our branding, our market reach in Southeast Asia region, and so forth. So what we did was we decided to build our own platform. We strip off from AirAsia.com was our platform, which we strip off from the airline, and we turn it into a go-to everyday app, like what you see in Meituan and so forth. And we built our logistic business, which was spun off from our cargo business. And also we have our fintech business, a financial services business that was inspired by what we saw travelers had to face when they move from one currency to another currency when they travel. So we decided that we need to build a digital bank to serve the underserved and get them better rates when they go traveling and so forth. So it has a life of its own, and it's become a fintech company. And we have our loyalty points, which we have turned into more of a point system for your everyday use. Before it was just for travel and so forth. So AirAsia Digital is basically us moving towards more of travel and lifestyle digital company as opposed to just becoming an airline. We have pivoted in such a great way, and COVID-19 has helped us to pivot faster than what we expected to be.
Thank you very much. Let's see, do we have Ibrahim up or do we not yet? Let's see.
Yeah.
Oh, he
I'm
is.
on. Can you hear me
Ibrahim,
now?
I absolutely can. If you could just briefly introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Ibrahim Ajami, and I head up the ventures business at Mubadala. Mubadala is a sovereign wealth fund based out of Abu Dhabi. We operate globally, and our ventures business is also global now in the US, Europe, in the Middle East, and also in China.
So this panel is called New Entrepreneurs for a New Economy. And for those who are watching, if you do have questions for our panelists, please send them in through the little button in the way you send them in, and I will get them on my computer, or so I am told, and that would be great. And we can have that conversation. So let's start with the person on this panel who is the entrepreneur, who is kind of the only startup entrepreneur on this, which is Nick. So Nick, let me ask you this. The pandemic, you talked about how it's kind of increased your business, right? Because fewer people wanting to physically go out to the grocery store the way they used to. So do you view this kind of paradoxically, has the pandemic been a boon for your company?
It's a great question. We wouldn't think about it that way. I mean, certainly in terms of demand, it absolutely has. It's also been an enormous challenge to scale to meet that demand. We really viewed it, though, more through the lens of our mission. So our mission is to make healthy living easy and accessible to everybody. And before the pandemic hit, literally tens of millions of Americans were dealing with access to healthy food. Half of American families don't live within driving distance of a healthy grocery store. Once the pandemic hit, it went to 100%. So every American family was trying to figure out how to stay healthy, how to stay safe. And so we used that as the filter to guide our action in a moment that was very turbulent. Supply chains were completely disrupted. We had to hire 400 people across our fulfillment network over the course of about 10 weeks. We went from having 700,000 paid members to nearly 1 million in the course of about 4 months. Yes, it was an opportunity. It was definitely an acceleration of the secular trends that as a business we're betting on in terms of online grocery and conscious consumption. But it was also a challenge, and it was also, again, more than anything, just this moment for our mission to step up and stay really focused while there was a lot of noise and intensity.
I'm wondering, have you been able to you talked about you've jumped up to 1 million. Have you been able to maintain them? I guess I wonder from the perspective of so many companies view the last several quarters as artificially low, right? If you're an Airbnb or you're an airline, possibly like an AirAsia, you say, you know what? We should be doing better than this. And this isn't a reflection on us. This is a reflection on the world. And we'll be back, in 6 months or whenever there's a vaccine widely distributed. I would think for you guys, the concern might be the opposite, that you have a lot of kind of pandemic customers. How do you kind of tell me, have you been able to keep them as things have opened up a little bit more? And how do you think about where your business will, say, be in 6 months compared to where it was, in March or April of 2020?
Yeah, I'd say two things there. And I think Steve spoke to this in the last discussion. The first is some things will go back and some things won't. I would say the things that will go back are the things that took a total left turn from where the trends were going before the pandemic. A lot of that will normalize. On the other hand, those things that were already secular trends before the pandemic, like online grocery, an early secular trend, but a rapid trend nonetheless, if that accelerates, I see that as a leapfrog of, in this case, 3, 4, 5 years of growth in that market. And there's no reason why it's going to regress. And so, will there be some regression everywhere? Absolutely. Some will go all the way back. I'd say in the space that we're in, it's not going to go fully back or even halfway back. Our model is also a little unique, and this is the second thing I'd say. As I said before, we're like Costco meets Whole Foods online in the sense that our members come in and pay an annual membership fee to participate. So we actually avoided a lot of the people that were coming in for a one and done order, just wanting to stock up on toilet paper or hand sanitizer. So some of those businesses that didn't have that barrier to entry of membership, I think probably did get a lot of short-termism. For us, we're actually seeing the cohorts that came in during the pandemic engaging more than any cohort in the history of the business. We're seeing, to your point, as things have normalized for overall demand for online grocery, that engagement continues. And so we're expecting it to really just be a long-term secular acceleration of where our business is going.
Irene, let me ask you about this from another angle, which is interesting. And correct me if I'm wrong about this, but AirAsia Digital now generates, or at least in the last quarter, generates more revenue than the actual air carrier business, what we would think of as AirAsia, people getting on planes and going back and forth. Is that accurate? And if it is, do you now feel a lot more pressure in the sense of you guys used to be kind of an offshoot and a thing that was going to grow and help the company in the future, but now you're a more core to its, imminent success or failure?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, before COVID-19, the airline was our core business, right? It's got 560 million people in our database. We have over 330 routes and 20,000 flights a day and so forth. And we have huge traffic going into AirAsia.com, which is about 50 million unique visitors per month, basically. And when COVID hits and during the lockdown, we had to ground our aircraft for 3 months, really. And it was probably, we were flying maybe less than 10% in terms of capacity. And now we're still able to fly, but most likely the capacity is probably just increased by another 30% across the region, across the Southeast Asia region, because borders are not really opening up. And whatever that we could fly, we were just flying goods to help with goods movements, cargo movements, and so forth. So we had to speed up what we were planning before the COVID situation. We were already thinking of how do we use this wealth of data of ours to build new business areas? How do we build new revenue stream? How do we pivot more than just moving people from one point to another point and build a whole new businesses with that data that we have? How do we repurpose it and work the assets even more? And I think it's probably a little bit of a blessing in disguise that speeds up what we needed to do and be more focused with our fintech, our platform, and our logistic businesses and so forth. That now you see that the revenue is slightly larger than what it is with the airline. Current situation, of course, is larger because there's not much coming in on airfares and so forth. But at the same time, we're also helping the community in where we serve, really. We are helping the small, medium enterprises because of the lockdown. They are struggling. And we decided, why don't you come over and be on our platform, since we have a lot of traffic before, and we can actually reach out to the database of people in terms of what we could sell for their basic necessities on a day-to-day basis and so forth. So we were also helping small, medium enterprises to be on our platform in the region. And that helped them as well. So I guess the whole purpose kind of like changed. We were becoming larger than what it was, from just an airline into a whole lifestyle travel ecosystem that facilitates everything, including logistic and fintech and so forth. And we're also helping the community to also survive, and helping them to build their tech skills, because when they go onto our platform, naturally they have to build new tech skills to help them with digital marketing, to help them to build a better homepage, to help them get traffic better, and so forth, basically.
Can I say as a follow-up to that, what you're talking about reminds me a little bit of Grab, right? Which starts as a ride-hail company, basically an Uber of Southeast Asia, and now is essentially a giant financial tech platform, payments platform, and all sorts of other stuff. Do you envision a time in which you talked about how AirAsia Digital right now generates more revenue because capacity is so low on the commercial carrier piece. When you and the company look forward 5-10 years, is digital a bigger part of the business? And if so, commercial air carriers don't do that well historically. It's not a great business. It's an okay business, not a great business. Is AirAsia Digital the future of the company, and at some point the carrier business could just get spun out?
Yes,
the commercial carrier part, not the business part.
Sorry. Yes, we believe so. We believe that AirAsia Digital is the future, and hence the reason why we started that journey more than 3 years ago, where we decided that we saw the value of the data that we own, and we decided that we need to ingest all this data coming from various systems and put them into Foundry so we can visualize it better. And because of that, we were able to build new business areas, because we were capitalizing and leveraging on the database that we have in Southeast Asia, which is the fastest growing nation in the world at the moment. And its demographics is so suitable for us to reach out to build other areas, there's a huge gap in the economy at that point, currently and also before. So yes, we do see digital business as the future. And I think we pivot in the fastest way possible. And I think this is really because of the vision that we have, that how can we make this data better for us? How can we actually work this even more, not only just to improve the revenue base, but also to increase the cost efficiency and productivity, so that we can even fly the planes better and can optimize the performance better in terms of the scheduling, in terms of fuel optimization, and so forth and all that. So we feel that we're in a really good position that once the border opens up, I think we'll be able to be more efficient than before. And I think that will actually feed into what the data that we already have, that we have tried to repurpose it to use it for bigger businesses and to feed the current demand and what we see the growth of the demand is in Southeast Asia.
Ibrahim, let me ask, talking to both Nick and Irene, they're talking about pivoting their businesses. Let me ask about yours, and specifically the ventures part of your business. Back in February, Sequoia Capital comes out, with its black swan slides. There's an assumption that, wow, all these VC firms that invested in these unicorn companies, these billion-dollar companies, are about to be in deep trouble or at least underwater. It doesn't feel like anything's changed. Valuations have continued to go up. Massive later stage financing rounds have continued to go up. Companies have successfully continued to go public. And with a couple exceptions, specifically kind of in the hospitality, call it leisure space, it seems like it's just business as usual outside of the lack of, business trips. Tell me I'm wrong. You're on mute. Ibrahim, you're on mute.
And
yep. Yeah, there you are. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've heard it. You've heard it in the.
Oh, we've lost you again. We're not getting you. They're going to try to figure out his sound. So Jeanette, let me ask, I guess, a similar question to you, but you're obviously on the earlier stage side of things. How has your investment, forget strategy, I guess, how has your activity changed over the last 8 months, or has it?
I think that's an interesting point, Dan. I think what we're seeing is that the pace of deal making has just accelerated massively. I think when the pandemic first hit in March, everybody was kind of, anticipating a slower investment pace and some degree of slowdown, and more wariness from an investor perspective. I think as soon as the dust had settled a little bit, what we have seen is that the adoption of technology has been so massive and so rapid across many, many sectors, except for the ones that were directly impacted by COVID, such as travel, for example, that the investment pace has accelerated to a degree we've never seen before. I think part of that reason is that entrepreneurs get to meet with like 6 funds over the course of one day. They see Sequoia in the morning and kind of Perkins in the afternoon kind of thing. And they can do that across the globe as everything is virtual anyway. And therefore decisions just get made very, very quickly. So you have to be able to move within, 2 or 3 days, what used to be more, weeks or at least 2 or 3 weeks time horizon. So I think that is one. I think the amount of capital that is going into the sector has been accelerated as well. I think as liquidity has risen, I think the need to allocate that into companies or into sectors that are still very much value driving has also accelerated. So I think the general influx of capital has also led to just more and more competition on rounds and basically, risen prices, at least from a European perspective. Because you see more American capital, for example, coming into Europe. Sequoia opening up an office here, for example, is just puts a different dynamic, I guess, also in pricing scale onto the European market. And then lastly, I'd say the fact that everything is remote has also helped our companies build more remote talent bases, which I think is an interesting trend. It's just allowed them to scale faster and grow into the new normal and the new challenge in a more efficient way. Because the biggest constraint most of our portfolio companies are still under is access to talent. And I think now that has become accessible globally, they start more thinking about how do we integrate that talent, how do we productize team culture, etc., rather than who do we get to hire or where can we find the best talent.
Guys, a quick follow-up, particularly when you're investing in a new company, in a new founder, or at least a new founder to you, how comfortable are you investing in someone who you have only met virtually, that you've never actually sat across, had a cup of coffee with? Because there's the stuff that's on the paper, and there's maybe a business plan or something else, and there's obviously references. But there's also just kind of that comfort level, like I'm about to invest a bunch of money in you, or my firm is. I want to feel like I believe in you beyond your idea. Has that been a challenge for you?
Not at all, and actually, I think we've always invested to some degree remotely. I think we've always built relationships with founders remotely. So I think that has been less of a challenge. I think what is interesting though is you cannot create the same degree of serendipity. I think what we kind of spending most time on is really building relationships with these entrepreneurs in a virtual capacity, which is not happening to the same degree when you meet someone for coffee. So we're trying to recreate the same type of, let's say, informal environment in calls, and just spend more time with these people remotely in order to really understand what's driving them, which especially at seed is so important, because we typically get to see is a very strong team as a dominant factor of our investment decision.
I think we have Ibrahim back. So I'll re-up what I asked earlier, which is this question of, it doesn't seem from the outside looking in, obviously you're the one involved in it, that your business, or at least your portfolio, has been nearly as negatively impacted as someone would expect. Kind of this whole thing where the real economy and the investment economy seem divorced from one another. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, listen, I think Sequoia did the right thing by sending the alarm bells. I think it's sent a shockwave to all the startup founders and all the companies, and you saw some incredible resiliency from the founders. But from an investment perspective and from a sector perspective, I think they couldn't have gotten it more wrong. Listen, this pandemic has accelerated technology in a real significant way. Areas like healthcare, e-commerce, financial services, and fintech. Even things like transportation and micromobility inside cities. Never ever could have anticipated such significant acceleration. Literally just 10 years of assumptions and projections were just sort of compacted and accelerated over a 10-month period. So, I think what's happened is, number one, a realization that technology is even more and more critical to, how societies and economies are going to function moving forward. And number two, from an investment perspective, is just, real capital going after some of the most strongest, successful companies, especially the ones that are looking to dominate the sectors that they're in. For us at Mubadala, Dan, I think what's important to note is, we've been saying this to founders for years, that, because their immediate question is, well, why is Mubadala a venture investor? And, we like to say, listen, we're long-term, we're steady, we support founders, we take a long-term perspective. We used to say this pre-pandemic all the time. And it wasn't until post-pandemic that realization with founders had become even more clear. Listen, we want investors that are long-term, that are stable, that are going to support us as we go through this significant shocks that are going to happen. But clearly now technology is central to how all our economies are going to move forward. So I think the answer is they got parts of it right, but I think, listen, the acceleration has happened, and we're in the middle of it.
I'm wondering, is there a flip side to that? In other words, when you look either in your portfolio or in other portfolios on the still private company side, are there certain companies that got left behind by this? You talk about the acceleration technology getting pulled forward, but are there certain companies that you think, or types of companies is probably a better way to put it, that have now been left behind and really have just been surpassed or passed over?
Listen, I think that we there's companies, whether it's sort of retail or hospitality or even banking. I mean, I think it sends shockwaves for a lot of these industries to say we have to change, we have to sort of think differently. Banks, for example, listen, countries now and governments are promoting, if not requiring, sort of digital payments and digital cash. That's number one. So all of a sudden you have a sort of wake up call with banks and how sort of money is flowed in an economy. Number two, small businesses. Small businesses have been significantly impacted given this pandemic. That's on one end. Number two, on the other side, it's what are the opportunities for small businesses? We invested in this company called Geo in India, a significant investment, and we did that all remotely.
You and everybody else, right? Everybody invested in that thing, right? You and like every other firm I know.
Yeah, us and every other reputable, important firm, we all invested significant capital in Geo. Geo is about enabling the hundreds of millions of small businesses in India. All right, so you got this sort of swaths of small businesses significantly getting impacted. But this is an opportunity for them to really build digital businesses, because these small companies now have access to the technologies and the tools that only large companies had access to before. So, call this sort of the small business revolution. I think it's going to happen in all parts of the world. In places like India, you see some significant change happening there. I just had a call with the TikTok team. I know that's a favorite topic of yours, Dan. TikTok, you don't think about sort of the ByteDance solution or the TikTok offering as sort of a small business offering. But it's really interesting because that's exactly where they're taking it. How do you use these technologies, content technologies, to enable small businesses to market themselves very differently in the future? A big part of it is driven by the pandemic.
Let's move in, and we've kind of been touching on it, but talk about kind of these things that are going to last and the things that might not. So Nick, for you, when you think about the changes to your business, not in terms of customer base and kind of acceleration of interest in Thrive from customers, but the way you actually operate, the way your team operates, what's the biggest change that you think will be long lasting for Thrive, and what's the biggest one that you think in 3 months, 6 months will dissipate? And then I guess as a side to that, since you just brought it up, do you guys have a TikTok channel? Is there a Thrive TikTok channel?
We do have a TikTok channel. I haven't been on it. We have been playing with ads on TikTok, and it's fascinating.
Is it working? Is it working for you guys? This is totally off topic, but I'm curious. Is it working?
It didn't back out for us, to be honest, but we've been iterating, and that's not uncommon for a new channel. To digress a little bit, our membership base, skewing towards millennials and Gen Z, we have as many people over the age of 50 as under the age of 30. So we really, we really are trying to target the masses, whether that's demographically or psychographically, unified by this, conscious consumer theme. To answer your question, though, I would say for us, one, it's very difficult to separate out the things that are changing internally from externally, because the external factors are driving, an internal shift in our strategy. And really, again, I would say less a shift and more an acceleration. And the two big trends there are just the acceleration of conscious consumers. Everybody, when the pandemic hit, began thinking about health and safety and transparency. And then, of course, the shift for online grocery. Specifically for how we're operating kind of as an organization, I'd say it actually was, again, an accelerant of the things that we've kind of philosophically and culturally tried to do as a business. We've always prized our flexibility, our adaptability, our resilience, our willingness to pursue the truth, even when we may not like it. One of our values is tenacity, so the ability to, once we know the truth, to barrel forward in a very aggressive way in pursuit of our mission. And then we've also really valued building all of that stuff into our culture, as opposed to building it into systems and process. And it's not to poo-poo systems.
Can I ask about culture? Can I just ask about culture? Because that's always a word that particularly startup or quasi-startup CEOs use a lot. Is it more difficult, not to establish, because you guys were around pre-pandemic, but how much harder is it to maintain the culture you want to maintain when most people are working out of their houses and not in the same rooms with one another on a regular basis?
It's a lot harder. But I would say that the kind of culture that just emerges, quote unquote, organically, that's a random phenomenon. So if you're going to build a great culture, you have to be directing it. You have to be thoughtful about it. You have to be deliberate about it, whether you're in person or you're remote. Now, if you don't have great ways of doing that in a remote world, you get nothing, because people aren't interacting enough. A lot of that organic stuff doesn't even emerge at all. So again, I feel like, you got to be deliberate about it either way. I know it's used as a kind of squishy word, as something that just sort of like emerges and is in the DNA. We view it a little bit differently. And we really view culture as a replacement for process and systems. And again, it's not to say that those things aren't important, but if you have a big ossified process that is, based on everyone being in person, and this person does this and comes over to this person's desk, and we have a meeting like this, and then the pandemic hits and all of a sudden your entire workforce is remote, things break down really fast. So I think our ability to adapt has been because of that focus on flexibility and a culture of resilience and tenacity. And, we just leaned in even more powerfully to that than ever. And also been, tenacious about stripping out the things that weren't necessary. And I don't see a world, yes, what's going to go back and what's not. We're definitely not going back to a place where 100% of our headquarters workers are working in the headquarters 100% of the time. And I think most companies will tell you that. We're also, though, not going to a world that's totally remote. So I think the future of the workplace is going to be dynamic. You're starting to hear that term go around, and it's true. But it's a big opportunity in our mind to get the best of both worlds if we can use the office for the things that it's actually necessary for. But it's not necessary for everybody to be bolted to a chair 10 hours a day, 5 days a week.
Jeanette, can I follow
Dan,
up?
can I make a comment about that?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, Dan. I think this builds on sort of Jeanette's point. Again, we're an investor that's deployed a couple of billion just this year, and we've done that all remotely. And I really like, when Nick said, it's, as an investor, we really have to develop very subtle tools and skills and ways of evaluating culture and organization when you're doing it remotely. You don't have the opportunity that we had before of spending hours and days inside companies and interacting with management. So what kind of slides are management putting up? How is the CEO interacting with the other members of the management team remotely? When you ask a question as an investor, when you're asking a question, over Zoom or over video, how is the CEO reacting, and how is he asking other members of the management team to answer that question? So you're going to have to develop very, very thoughtful ways of asking questions to be able to decipher and pull out, how does this culture in this company operate? What makes a successful executive in that company? because you have to assume that we're going to keep investing, and we're going to keep building companies remotely. We can't just assume that we're going to go back to how things were. I think that there's a whole debate about permanency, but just to go back to how things were in the past, I think we should stop assuming that, and we have to develop that as a part of how we run our businesses as investors.
I wonder those different. Sure. And Jeanette, I want you to speak to that, and also then let me follow up just to ask: Are those different ways potentially of asking questions, or those different ways of analyzing things? If things go back to some extent to how they were in terms of some in-person meetings, do those things transfer back over? In other words, does this make, when I say you, kind of VCs as a whole, better investors going forward, or is this just a moment in time?
They have to. They have to make us better investors. They have to make us better partners. Again, ventures and tech. Ventures is not just about investing. Ventures is about building companies. It has to make you a better partner long term, because you are remotely developing the capabilities and the muscle to become more human. So if you add to that the physical component, you just have to be a better partner. So our goal as we enhance and improve our muscle of evaluating companies remotely, that when things at least come back to some sort of normalcy, or at least you're able to travel and interact, that you're going to be a better partner. And I think that's a plus. That's a net positive to how we look at the investment craft.
Jeanette, I think you wanted to hop in.
No, I think what you were saying, Ibrahim, is really interesting, especially with regards to what new wave of technology is actually needed in order to sustain that trend, right? I think that's something we've always had a focus on the future of work, since 4 years, so long before the pandemic actually hits. But the acceleration of these types of technologies is just insane, and we see that across our portfolio. But looking at the huge white spaces all of us experience every day, they are just massive, right? I think most of our Zoom sessions are like modern seances, where it's basically like, can you hear me? Yes, I can hear you. So it's like, let's say, this whole problem of latency, the problem of serendipity, the problem of cultural assessment that you pointed to, all lead to kind of enhanced investment theses at our end. So I think the question we're really pondering is like, how will we be able to measure productivity going forward? How will we be able to ensure people's mental health as edges between private and working life continues to blur? Like, how can we be able to productize team culture? I think that's just something that must happen to some degree, because it's so hard to instill that unless you're really in one room. And I think all of these these areas will just trigger a whole wave of new companies that we get really, really excited by. However, I do think that there is like this, there are certain things that are here to stay and others that will probably go back to normal to some degree. So looking at how that shapes into, our investment process and diligence is very much around the fact that a lot of these new companies are probably, for example, education. Like my confirmed thesis is that education will largely go back to normal. Looking at medicine or grocery deliveries, those will likely kind of continue to stay. So I think filtering that down to new companies that we're seeing is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about that. And I think in general, the other aspect that I wanted to mention, which is more related to what Irene said earlier, is that the trend of let's say adoption of technology by larger established industry companies is just accelerating like even further or even faster than remote work, I think. So I think everybody has realized that keeping their data in silos is not working. So they need to make that data accessible, which is something that most companies have been working on or pondering over the past 2 years. And now they're really reaching that inflection point, which basically makes it really, really interesting for us as investors into B2B technology companies, because they are now really ready to absorb fully productized and automated solutions, because all of these companies need to come out leaner. They need to come out faster. Yeah. They need to come out more efficient. And I think all of that is really playing into the hands of an ever kind of widening, opportunity landscape for technology investments these days.
Irene, can I ask some of the things that have gotten raised here, because you obviously run an organization there, and Jeanette just talked about this question of kind of, the phrase always gets work-life balance, but it's become a little bit screwy for a lot of people here. When you think about your organization and the push you've made and the way your people are working, Do you have fear that your people are getting burned out and that in 3 or 4 months you're going to need a whole new crew?
Yeah, sometimes I do fear that they might get burned out because working from home is actually a lot harder, and people tend to work harder than if they were to go to the office. Naturally, they're not wasting time traveling, and sometimes meeting starts at 8 a.m. and it finishes around 8 p.m. or so forth. So we need to be quite disciplined in terms of
You have a
giving people
12-hour
breaks.
meeting? Oh my Lord. Oh God, that sounds
No,
awful.
I
Sorry,
mean,
continue. That sounds terrible.
yeah. So it's you know, we, and at the speed that we're trying to pivot as well, and the fact that we're trying to seize the opportunities is where we see, and try to fulfill the demand as where we see, it does get very tiring, and it does get pretty burnt out. So it's very important to actually have to continuous communicate with the team in a non-working sense, in terms of encouragement and so forth. And I think it's difficult to do that if you're not in a space where in the workplace you are able to meet each other and you're able to joke with each other and so forth. But in it's a little bit more tense when it comes to working from home. But it's something that people are used to. I mean, our tech team is completely used to all those. In terms of our commercial team, I think they need to they tend to feel like they need to go to the office or go elsewhere to be able to work and deliver basically. So yes, I
Can
mean,
I ask as a piece of that? Is there kind of, call it a rule or a policy that you or the organization has put into place, say in the last 3 or 4 months, to kind of try to prevent is the wrong word, but to minimize some of those concerns, some of that tenseness, as you called it?
yeah, so we have a culture department in our people's department. Our people's department is actually human resource. So there's a cultural department there that actually looks in terms of how do we get the team motivated, and there'll be groups of communities within our workplace that are encouraged to look at their outside work kind of interest and so forth. So I think that kind of like helps when we have this workplace, which we use Facebook at this point in time, really to interact with everyone from various departments, from various countries in the region and so forth, to get updated, rather than just focus on the work that needs to be delivered and so forth. Yes, so the culture department team is really important to help with the situation.
Nick, similar question to you. Is there something that you or Thrive did in the relative early days of the pandemic vis-a-vis your employees that you had to pivot and you had to say, wait a minute, either this isn't sustainable or this is a mistake, and that you guys made a significant change?
There were so many of them, honestly. I mean, it was such an adjustment. It all happened so quickly. For us, we have 800 employees. 2/3 of those are in our fulfillment centers. And as I mentioned before, the number of people in the fulfillment centers doubled in the course of just 6 to 8 weeks. So the biggest thing for us actually was just putting safety precautions in place to make sure that we were putting the safety and the health of our thrivers before anything else. So that was a whole process of whether it was temperature checks or masks or social distancing in the warehouse. We were having to change pick lanes and modify job descriptions and just do all sorts of protocol changes that were super dynamic. And then I think overall with the company, and especially with the headquarters workers, this issue of both burnout, but also just fear and loneliness and the toll on mental health. Even as we were getting 4 or 6, 8 weeks into the pandemic, that really acute period where there were shutdowns and shelter in place was just very, very it's challenging for the business, but also just challenging on a human level. So the number one thing we did there was over communication. And, this is, again, it's been a pillar of our culture in the past. Like, we do weekly all hands with the entire company, coming in person historically. Now, we're still doing a weekly all hands that's more sort of culturally focused, as well as a weekly business review to just get people lined up on the numbers and metrics. For the first, I would say, 2 months, as we were really adjusting to all the changes and just the influx of demand, I actually did a daily stand-up with 25 plus leaders across the business. And there are aspects of interaction that are much more difficult with remote. But actually, some of those big meetings are a lot easier to execute when you're on Zoom. People don't have to be coming in to an office. They don't have to be changing their place. They literally just log in. And so we'll have meetings that are as short as 15 or 30 minutes. And the stand-up has become something that, while it was part of what we did before, is now just absolutely integral to the rhythm of the entire company.
Abraham, I'm curious, when you think of your CEOs, the ones you had pre-pandemic and that obviously you still have, do you feel for the most part that I hate to put anybody on the spot, but to say, were they honest with you, or do you think some of them were hiding the ball from you while they were trying to figure out what was happening to their business?
Listen, Dan. I mean, I would say, first of all, AirAsia, great companies out there. I don't know if we'd invest in a company that has a culture department. Listen, when a CEO, we had this call with the CEO, and I asked the question about leadership and how he thinks about his team. He puts up the slide, and it puts up a slide of this sort of all the pictures of his management team, and he's like, well, my picture's in the middle, it's not the first. That's not culture. That's not culture. I mean, I think, rather than hiding, I don't know if they were hiding. Listen, Silicon Valley companies are always pushing what's reality and what's fantasy. That's the nature of the business we're in. We're always creating new realms, new possibilities. So it's okay to push. I think what we look for more is around, specifically what Nick said, how are these companies, not just from a business perspective, from a people perspective, from a market, from a product, how are they using these new technologies and new platforms just to change the way they operate and think and behave day in and day out? Let me just give you an example. We made an investment in the company called Reef. You have these sort of parking structures, these dormant parking structures around cities, right? These either sort of underbuildings or sort of these really ugly fixtures around cities. And we initially sort of invested in this company based on, okay, well, what kind of sort of parking returns do you get? You fast forward 12 months, I think, San Francisco well, Dan. I'm sitting in downtown San Francisco and I want to order a Beyond Burger, delivered from Marina, that's going to cost, almost 3 times the cost of that burger just to deliver it across the city. Why don't you take these dormant infrastructure, these parking structures, because cities anyways have to change. I think we know that. How do you take these, dormant infrastructures and transform them into logistics hubs? So, that's an example about how you really transform an entire business, an entire thesis, and you got to shift the mindset and the culture and the business and the product, and you got to get the investors on board. I'll tell you, Dan, over the past 12 months, we've seen some incredible stories, some of these founders, and how sort of they've shifted their business. Color Genomics was, we invested in Color Genomics as a DNA testing for population health. This is one of the leading companies today for COVID testing. So how do you really take a lot of your technology foundation and pivot it for what's required in the market? And I'll tell you, we've been just truly inspired by the quality of what we've seen, around the world.
By the way, I don't want it to go without being said. To say I am sitting in downtown San Francisco and want to mobile order a Beyond Burger, maybe the most San Francisco statement I have ever heard in my life. Jeanette, we have a couple of audience questions, and let me, Jeanette, ask you one, which is, I know you said that you guys did a lot of your, pre-COVID, did a lot of your investing virtually, but I'm wondering in general, do you feel that, once we get back to whatever we want to call normal, do you believe that you will go back to in-person meetings? Kind of will the pre-COVID due diligence deal process return, or is this a new normal in the way you operate?
I think it really very much also depends on if the speed stays at that level. Then I think that what we're seeing right now is you couldn't possibly jump on a plane fast enough to kind of meet the person before the deal is closed, right? So I think the question is, what will entrepreneurs optimize?
Can I ask? Does that freak you out? Because I would think if I'm an investor, that would freak me out. If it's one thing to say, you know what, we have to do things via Zoom because that's the world we live in. It's a very another thing to say, you know what, we have to make our decision 5 times faster than we used to because otherwise we'll lose the deal. That would worry me. Does that worry you?
It does, Dan, but I think what it just has led us to do is become just really, really sharp around our hypotheses on what we're looking for in markets. For example, sustainability. We have, dug into this market over the past 1.5 years. We really understand, I think, at least to a large extent, what the drivers are and what needs to be built in that sector. And now it just helps us to move much faster as opportunities surface. And that is just true for a large amount of other areas. And I think we're also just quicker at just saying no to stuff that we don't think fits our core in the right way.
Yeah, I agree with that, Dan. I just want to add to that. I just want to add something really quick to that. You know what it's helped us do? This business is about identifying great companies and doing everything you can to make it greater. What this has helped us do is identify great companies much quicker. You don't drag your feet anymore by saying, well, it's not great. Well, it's good. It can be great. It's good, or it's okay, but it can be great. In this model here, you're just going to identify it much quicker, and you're going to know and develop conviction much quicker. And you have no choice.
Irene, I wonder for you, particularly on the travel tech side or the hospitality tech side, is this a moment where it would seem if I'm an entrepreneur and I want to start a new company, this would not be the sector I would necessarily jump into right now? I wonder, you guys, do you make investments in outside companies potentially with an eye towards bringing them in-house? And how are you seeing that environment right now?
We did before when resources, cash weren't an issue and so forth, right? We did small investments in companies around the world where we think it would fit into our into what we want to achieve. Basically, when we invested in a voice AI company, we invested in a productivity company in Thailand and so forth. But now what we have focused is more on looking at companies that maybe we could do joint venture with, or maybe we could see what we could have in terms of strategic fit that will create the value faster or create growth faster, and create that market faster, basically. So that's more of the focus right now. And apart from us building what we need to build, what are other companies out there that we could complement each other and see where there could be business opportunities together as well in the region to create a better marketplace.
And finally, Nick, this is a question from the audience, and I guess which asks, it says, what are your thoughts on investments in new superfood companies that took off due to COVID? I guess I'll kind of ask a piece of that, which is when you look at products that could end up on the Thrive platform, how do you try, and you see things that maybe are getting market traction, how do you try to separate the ones that are kind of COVID traction from non-COVID traction, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the first thing is zooming out. We're a hyper curated platform. So, already spoken to this idea from an investment standpoint of having a really clear hypothesis or set of convictions around what you're looking for. That's our criteria for merchandise and product selection. And in each category, they look a little bit different. But for us, it starts with the qualities around sustainability and around health that we believe in. So if it's what you're putting on your body in the home, we're looking at EWG rankings. If it is what you're putting in your body, we are non-GMO on the entire food catalog. We are pushing towards organic on about 96% today. And we're pushing to the next level of regenerative. So we use different set of criteria, but we're rigorous, we're clear about it, and we run everything through that filter because, again, the incoming noise is so loud, and there is so much stuff that looks on trend and is getting traction here or whatever there. We've got to be able to filter through the things that really matter. The second thing I would say, just related specifically to the pandemic, you did see a huge boost in the in immunity boost type products. So whether it's superfoods or the supplements that people were focused on for just staying healthy, you also saw a massive growth in random categories or seemingly random categories like hand sanitizer and toilet paper that people were stocking up on during the pandemic. Again, I use that same reference or that same sort of framework I said earlier. If it feels like it's orthogonal to the direction the world is going, then we're not really as interested in it. Like, we will carry what we need to get us through the pandemic. We're not going to invest deeply. And if it feels like it's an acceleration of a trend that really, zooming out is going to be here in 5 or 10 years, then we're going to go deep and find the right partner, the right products, and really, assort it and educate our members about it effectively.
I lied. I have a final question for you. Thrive hasn't raised money, at least to my knowledge, since last year. So pre-pandemic, the summer of 19. In a year from now, if we're having this conversation, maybe actually on stage in LA at the Hilton, is Thrive a public company, either via IPO or SPAC?
No comment. I think we've definitely observed what's happening in the SPAC markets with a lot of interest. We're not ready to be a public company.
Can I ask, are you, because I'm hearing this from a lot of companies that are in your general space in terms of how much money you've raised, how long you've been around, kind of general valuation. Is it fair to say you guys are getting called a lot by SPACs?
I get multiple calls every single day. It's crazy, and it's hard to filter through the noise. So again, at this point, we've just said we're not thinking about going public in any way for X period, and so I'm not going to really have those interactions.
What's the X? What's the X?
What's that?
You said X period. You said X period. How's that algebra work? What's the X equal?
It's months, not years, for us to consider it. I mean, we're doing hundreds of millions in sales. We're growing very fast than we were before the pandemic, and we're going to be profitable next year and pretty darn close to it this year. So we feel like we're in a really strong position, whether it's going with the SPAC route or it's doing a more traditional IPO or if we're looking at something like a direct listing. For us, it's less about how we go public and more doing it the right way at the right time, and again, being ready for the long term and being a successful public company.
And let me ask the other side of this, Ibrahim. This is the final question of this panel, which is: are you guys raising a SPAC, and when should I expect to see it pop up on my computer?
We're looking at it. We're going to explore it. I mean, it's one of the instruments. It's one of the vehicles. We're open to looking at it. We have a large portfolio, not only with Mubadala, but as you know, with a lot of our partners, whether it's SoftBank or Silver Lake or Hill House. I think it's an exciting time to look at some of these vehicles. It doesn't mean that we're going to do it, but but we're open to it. I think more important than that, Dan, I think is, I love what Nick was talking about today after this panel. Maybe you should just take money from us versus sort of going public via some SPAC. At the end of the day, it's just, this is at Mubadala, even though we're a very large sort of sovereign wealth fund, this is at its core a people business and investing in people and supporting people through this very, very tumultuous cycle and journey. And, it's just about being stable, consistent, long-term partners. This is what, the pandemic is really showing, that we can be very different and very strong. And it's accelerated, it's accelerated so many different aspects. And for a venture investor like us, it's just put us on the map.
You guys, since you're on a Zoom right now, and I keep hearing, and Jeanette kept talking about how deals are getting done very quickly. If the two of you, we can sit back. Do you guys just want to negotiate this out real quick? I don't know, 90 seconds and just get a deal done, and then we can be good. Hey, I want to thank everybody for joining. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I appreciate it.
Thank you.